They had no idea that the woman they were about to publicly humiliate and demand be searched like a criminal was the mother of the billionaire CEO who was personally funding their entire evening of luxury. When Gloria Samuels admired a diamond brooch at the exclusive Art for Hope charity gala, she triggered a chain of discrimination so devastating that it would end with her son buying the entire auction and destroying a prestigious organization. Watch as a wealthy socialite tears up an invitation and calls security on the event's primary sponsor's mother, as elite patrons record what they think is justice but document their own moral failure, and as a son's love transforms into the most expensive act of family protection in charity history. But this isn't just about one night's injustice becoming spectacular revenge. This is about how strategic power can transform individual discrimination into community empowerment, how millions in art meant for elite collectors became accessible to underserved children, and how one family's dignity defended became an entire generation's opportunities created. You're about to witness what happens when assumptions meet unlimited resources, when family loyalty meets strategic brilliance, and when the excluded become the ultimate beneficiaries of their excluders' downfall. Stay until the end to see how this single evening of prejudice became a permanent lesson in the true meaning of justice and community transformation. They had no idea that the woman they were about to accuse of theft was the mother of the billionaire who was personally funding their entire evening of luxury and charity. Gloria Samuels adjusted the delicate pearl necklace her son had given her for her 70th birthday as she stepped into the opulent ballroom of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, her arm linked gently with that of her son, Derek. To the hundreds of elegantly dressed guests swirling around them with champagne glasses and whispered conversations about arts and philanthropy, she looked like exactly what she was – a proud mother accompanying her successful son to an important event. But what most of the room didn't know was that Gloria Samuels had earned every moment of this evening through decades of sacrifice, struggle, and unwavering belief in her son's potential. 35 years ago, she had been a single mother working 3 jobs to keep food on the table while Derek studied by lamplight at their kitchen table. She had sewn his clothes, packed his lunches in brown paper bags, and somehow found money for books and school supplies even when the rent was overdue. When scholarship offers came in from prestigious universities, she had cried tears of joy and pride, knowing that her sacrifices were creating opportunities she could never have imagined for herself. Now, Derek stood beside her as the guest of honor and lead sponsor of the Art for Hope charity gala, an annual event that raised millions for arts education in underserved communities. His logistics empire, built from a single delivery truck and an unshakable work ethic, had grown into a nationwide operation that employed thousands and generated hundreds of millions in revenue. But success hadn't changed the fundamental truth that drove every major decision in his life. Everything he had accomplished was built on the foundation of his mother's love, sacrifice, and belief in his dreams. "The art is beautiful this year," Gloria said softly, her voice carrying the kind of quiet appreciation that came from someone who had learned to find beauty in small moments throughout a life that hadn't always been easy. "That landscape painting reminds me of the park where I used to take you when you were little. Do you remember? We'd pack those peanut butter sandwiches and pretend we were having elegant picnics." Derek smiled, the memory warming him even in the midst of the formal business networking that these events required. "I remember everything, Mom, including how you always saved the bigger half of the sandwich for me even when I knew you were still hungry." Those moments of sacrifice had shaped not just Derek's character but his approach to business and philanthropy. Every scholarship his company funded, every community program they supported, every opportunity they created for young entrepreneurs was rooted in his understanding of what it meant to struggle and dream simultaneously. He had insisted that Gloria accompany him tonight because her presence reminded him why success mattered, not for the luxury or recognition, but for the power to lift others the way she had lifted him. As Derek moved toward a group of prominent donors who wanted to discuss expanding the scholarship program, Gloria found herself drawn to a display case near the auction area. Inside, nestled on midnight blue velvet, was an antique diamond brooch that caught the light with every subtle movement in the room. The piece was exquisite, clearly valuable, and, according to the placard, all proceeds from its auction would support arts education for children whose families couldn't afford private lessons or supplies. Gloria studied the brooch with the appreciation of someone who understood both beauty and value. Remembering the costume jewelry she had worn to job interviews and church services when Derek was young, each piece carefully chosen and maintained because it had to last. The contrast between then and now wasn't lost on her, but neither was the gratitude that filled her heart for the journey that had brought them both to this moment. She had no way of knowing that someone was watching her with growing suspicion, making assumptions based on her quiet demeanor and the fact that she wasn't adorned with the obvious displays of wealth that characterized most of the evening's attendees. She had no idea that her simple appreciation for beautiful art was about to be twisted into something ugly by someone who couldn't imagine that grace, dignity, and worthiness came in forms that didn't match their narrow expectations. If you believe that a mother's love and sacrifice deserve respect regardless of the package they come in, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who understands that true worth isn't measured by jewelry or designer clothes, but by the character that shines through in every action. Subscribe because you're about to witness what happens when assumptions about who belongs where meet the reality of family loyalty and the power of unconditional love. Right at that moment, as Gloria stood appreciating the beauty of art that would soon help children discover their own creative potential, she became the target of exactly the kind of prejudice her son's success was supposed to protect her from. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, a woman whose inherited wealth had never taught her the difference between price and value, approached the display case with the predatory focus of someone who viewed charity events as shopping opportunities rather than chances to serve others. Eleanor's eyes swept over Gloria with the kind of calculating assessment that had nothing to do with getting to know another person and everything to do with determining their place in her carefully constructed social hierarchy. What Eleanor saw was a woman in an elegant but obviously not designer dress, wearing jewelry that was beautiful but clearly not from the exclusive boutiques that Eleanor frequented, standing alone without the obvious entourage that usually accompanied the truly wealthy to events like this. In Eleanor's world, people who looked like Gloria were staff, not guests. They were there to serve champagne, not sip it. They were present to admire the artwork from a respectful distance, while the real patrons decided which pieces deserved their investment. The possibility that Gloria might be someone's beloved mother, someone's honored guest, someone worthy of respect and dignity, simply didn't register in Eleanor's narrow understanding of who belonged in spaces like this. As Gloria leaned slightly closer to read the detailed description of the brooch's history and provenance, Eleanor's suspicion crystallized into something far more dangerous: absolute certainty about something she had never bothered to verify. "Excuse me," Eleanor called out, her voice carrying the kind of sharp authority that she had learned could cut through any room and command immediate attention. "Security! Security! We have a situation here!" The volume and urgency of her voice caused conversations throughout the nearby area to halt, heads to turn, and a circle of curious onlookers to begin forming around the display case. Gloria looked up in confusion, her first instinct being to help with whatever emergency had prompted such an urgent call for security. But Eleanor's next words made it devastatingly clear that Gloria wasn't a potential helper in this situation. She was the target.
"This woman just tried to pocket the diamond brooch," Eleanor declared, her voice projecting across the ballroom with theatrical outrage. "I saw her attempting to open the case. She's trying to steal from a charity auction."
The accusation hit the gathering crowd like a physical blow. Gasps rippled through the elegant guests as they turned to stare at Gloria, who stood frozen in shock at the magnitude of what was being suggested. The woman who had spent her entire life working honestly, sacrificing for her family, and earning every small comfort through decades of dedication, was being publicly branded a thief by someone who had never worked a day for anything she owned. Eleanor's social circle, a group of women who had learned that the quickest way to elevation in their hierarchy was to tear down anyone who threatened their sense of superiority, immediately rallied to support her accusation. They formed a semicircle around Gloria, pointing and murmuring, their designer gowns and glittering jewelry creating a wall of judgment that transformed a charity gala into a public trial. "I knew something was off when I saw her hovering around the expensive pieces," added Margaret Wentworth, Eleanor's closest ally in social warfare. "She doesn't look like our usual donors. How did she even get in here?" "Security should search her bag immediately," chimed in Victoria Sterling, her voice dripping with the kind of false concern that made her suggestion sound reasonable while her intent remained purely malicious, "before she can dispose of evidence or pass anything to an accomplice." Gloria stood at the center of this storm of accusation, her dignity intact, but her heart breaking at the realization that her son's moment of triumph, his opportunity to celebrate the values they both cherished, was being poisoned by the very prejudices he had worked his entire life to overcome. The woman who had taught him that character mattered more than circumstances, that respect was earned through action rather than appearance, was being publicly humiliated based on nothing more than the color of her skin and the assumptions of people who had never learned to see past their own privilege. The irony was devastating and complete. At an event dedicated to bringing art and opportunity to underserved communities, the lead sponsor's mother was being treated as if she didn't deserve to exist in the same space as the people whose donations were supposedly motivated by concern for social justice and equality. No one expected what happened next to transform this elegant charity gala into a battlefield where family honor would collide with social prejudice in the most devastating way possible. Across the grand ballroom, Derek Samuels was concluding a conversation with the director of the Children's Arts Foundation when Eleanor's voice cut through the refined atmosphere like a knife through silk. The words "thief" and "steal from a charity" reached his ears with crystal clarity, but his brain initially refused to process what he was hearing. When Derek turned toward the commotion, the sight that greeted him would be burned into his memory forever. There, surrounded by a circle of pointing, whispering socialites in their glittering gowns and cold judgment, stood his mother. The woman who had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities she could never have imagined for herself. The woman whose quiet strength had carried him through every challenge and whose unwavering belief had made his success possible. The woman who had taught him that dignity was something you carried inside yourself, not something that could be bought or inherited. But in that moment, Gloria looked smaller than he had ever seen her before. Not because she was cowering or showing fear, but because the weight of public humiliation and false accusation was pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. Her hands remained steady, her posture upright, her expression composed, but Derek could see the hurt in her eyes from across the room. It was the same look she had worn when landlords had threatened eviction, when bill collectors had called during dinner, when the world had seemed determined to break her spirit but had never quite managed to succeed. A knot of cold fury, unlike anything Derek had ever experienced, began to form in his chest.
This wasn't just an attack on a random stranger. This was an assault on the person whose love had made everything in his life possible. These people, in their designer clothes and inherited privilege, were publicly humiliating the woman who had more character in her smallest gesture than they had managed to accumulate in their entire pampered lives. The irony was so complete it felt almost scripted. Here, at an event dedicated to supporting arts education for underprivileged children, at a gala that Derek's company was funding specifically to create opportunities for kids who looked like he had as a child, his own mother was being treated as if her presence was somehow criminal. The very people who would applaud speeches about inclusion and opportunity were demonstrating that their compassion had strict boundaries that excluded anyone who didn't match their narrow expectations of who deserved to occupy elite spaces.
But what made Derek's blood run cold wasn't just the accusation itself. It was watching the crowd's reaction. Instead of questioning Eleanor's claims, instead of demanding evidence before jumping to conclusions, instead of showing even basic human decency to someone who was clearly distressed, the gathering guests were pulling out their phones. They were recording what they assumed would be the dramatic exposure of a charity gala thief, turning his mother's humiliation into content for their social media feeds. The clicking of camera phones and the soft glow of recording videos created a surreal backdrop to what was unfolding. These people who fancied themselves cultured and sophisticated were documenting what they believed to be someone else's downfall without ever considering that they might be witnessing and participating in something far more shameful, the public destruction of an innocent woman's dignity based on nothing more than prejudice and assumption. Derek began moving toward the commotion, his jaw set with the kind of determination that had built a business empire from nothing. But with each step, he was calculating not just how to defend his mother, but how to ensure that everyone who had participated in this humiliation would understand exactly what they had done and exactly who they had chosen to attack. The guests recording the incident had no idea they were documenting their own moral failure. They thought they were capturing evidence of theft, but they were actually creating a permanent record of discrimination, prejudice, and the kind of casual cruelty that revealed the true character of people who claimed to support justice and opportunity while practicing the exact opposite. As Derek approached the circle of accusers surrounding his mother, he understood that this moment would define not just the evening, but the relationship between his family and his entire social circle forever. They had chosen to see his mother as a threat to be eliminated rather than a person to be respected. Now, they were about to discover exactly what kind of threat they had actually created by attacking the person he loved most in the world. But the tragedy had not stopped yet, and what happened next would prove that some people's commitment to prejudice runs so deep that they're willing to destroy their own reputations to maintain it. The event security team, led by Captain Marcus Thompson, a 20-year veteran of corporate security who had worked hundreds of high-profile events, arrived at the commotion with the kind of professional composure that came from years of managing delicate situations involving powerful people and fragile egos. Captain Thompson immediately recognized the precarious nature of what he was walking into. On one side stood Mrs. Eleanor Vance, a woman whose family foundation had donated millions to various causes throughout the city, and whose displeasure could end careers and destroy professional relationships with a single phone call. Her influence extended far beyond this single event, reaching into museum boards, hospital foundations, and university endowments that kept cultural institutions functioning. On the other side stood an older black woman whose quiet dignity and unshakable composure suggested someone accustomed to handling adversity with grace. Everything about her demeanor, from her perfect posture to her careful attention to her appearance,
spoke of someone who understood that she would be judged more harshly than others, and had spent a lifetime rising to meet those unfair expectations. "What seems to be the problem here?" Captain Thompson asked, his voice carefully neutral as he surveyed the crowd of onlookers who had formed a semicircle around the display case. His trained eye immediately noted the expensive jewelry in the case remained undisturbed. The security glass showed no signs of tampering, and there was no physical evidence of any attempted theft. Eleanor stepped forward with the commanding presence of someone accustomed to having her word accepted without question. "Captain, this woman attempted to steal the diamond brooch from the auction display. I witnessed her trying to open the case, and when I called attention to the situation, she became evasive and suspicious." The accusation hung in the air while Captain Thompson's professional instincts told him something didn't add up. In his experience, actual thieves didn't typically linger at crime scenes when discovered, didn't maintain the kind of calm composure Gloria was displaying, and certainly didn't dress with the obvious care and attention that characterized Gloria's appearance. "Ma'am," Captain Thompson addressed Gloria directly, "I'm going to need to ask you some questions to help us sort this out. Can you tell me what brought you to this particular display case?" Gloria's response was clear, measured, and completely reasonable. "I was admiring the brooch because it's beautiful, and I was reading about how the auction proceeds will support arts education. My son and I are here tonight specifically because we believe in that mission."
But Eleanor wasn't satisfied with reasonable explanations or the lack of evidence supporting her claims. The possibility that she might have been wrong, that she might have publicly humiliated an innocent person based on her own prejudices, seemed to make her double down on her accusations rather than consider the alternative. "Captain Thompson," Eleanor said, her voice taking on a sharper edge, "I don't think you understand the gravity of this situation. I am telling you that I witnessed attempted theft. I am demanding that you search this woman's handbag immediately, right here, in front of everyone, so we can resolve this matter once and for all." The demand sent a ripple of uncomfortable murmurs through the crowd. Even some of Eleanor's supporters seemed to recognize that demanding a public search of someone's personal belongings without any evidence of wrongdoing crossed a line from suspicion into humiliation. Captain Thompson found himself caught between his professional obligations and his growing certainty that he was being asked to participate in something that had nothing to do with security and everything to do with prejudice. The woman Eleanor was accusing showed none of the behavioral patterns he had learned to associate with theft, while Eleanor's insistence on public humiliation rather than private resolution suggested motivations that had little to do with justice. "Mrs. Vance," Captain Thompson said carefully, "our standard procedure in situations like this is to review security footage first and then determine if additional steps are necessary. I think that would be the most appropriate way to handle this situation." But Eleanor's response revealed just how little interest she had in facts, evidence, or appropriate procedures. "I don't want to wait for footage reviews," she snapped. "I want this handled now, publicly, so everyone can see that we don't tolerate theft at charity events. Search your bag now, or I'll make sure this entire security team is replaced by people who understand the importance of protecting our donors and our property." The threat was unmistakable, and Captain Thompson realized he was being forced to choose between his professional integrity and his employment. Eleanor was demanding that he humiliate an innocent woman to satisfy her prejudices, and she was willing to destroy his career if he refused to comply. As the tension reached a breaking point, with phones still recording and voices growing louder, Gloria made a decision that would change everything. Instead of submitting to the humiliation being demanded of her, instead of allowing herself to be searched like a criminal in front of hundreds of witnesses, she reached into her purse with the kind of calm deliberation that suggested she had a plan that none of her accusers could imagine. If you've ever watched someone you love being unfairly attacked and felt that burning need to protect them at any cost, hit that like button right now. Share this with someone who understands that a mother's dignity is worth fighting for, no matter what it takes. Subscribe, because you're about to witness what happens when family loyalty meets unlimited resources, and trust me, you don't want to miss the moment when love and power combine to deliver the kind of justice that changes everything.
But what happened next would become the moment that transformed a charity gala into a masterclass in strategic power and family loyalty that would be talked about for decades. As Captain Thompson reluctantly reached toward Gloria to begin the humiliating search that Eleanor was demanding, Gloria did something that no one in that glittering crowd could have anticipated. Instead of submitting to the degradation, instead of allowing herself to be treated like a criminal in front of hundreds of witnesses, she calmly withdrew her phone from her purse with the deliberate precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The gesture was so unexpected, so completely contrary to what everyone assumed a cornered thief would do, that the entire crowd fell into a confused silence. Eleanor's triumphant expression faltered slightly as she watched Gloria handle her phone with the kind of confident familiarity that suggested this wasn't a desperate last resort, but a calculated strategic move. "What do you think you're doing?" Eleanor demanded, her voice sharp with the irritation of someone whose dramatic moment was being interrupted by unexpected behavior. "Put that phone away. We're in the middle of resolving this theft situation." But Gloria ignored Eleanor completely. Her attention was focused entirely on her phone as she scrolled through her contacts with the unhurried precision of someone who knew exactly who she needed to reach and exactly what she was going to say. The crowd watched in fascination as this woman, who they had assumed was powerless and cornered, demonstrated the kind of calm authority that suggested she had resources and options that none of them had considered. Captain Thompson paused in his reluctant approach, his professional instincts telling him that something fundamental was shifting in the dynamics of this confrontation. In his 20 years of security work, he had never seen an accused thief respond to the threat of search by making a phone call with this level of composed confidence. Gloria found the contact she was looking for and pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, and then a familiar voice answered with the warmth and concern that only came from genuine family connection. "Mom, is everything okay? Where are you?" Derek's voice carried clearly in the suddenly quiet space around the display case, and Gloria's response would echo through that ballroom and into social media history with devastating precision. "Derek, honey," Gloria said, her voice steady and clear enough for everyone in the immediate vicinity to hear. "Mrs. Vance here is accusing me of being a thief. She's demanding that security search my handbag in front of all these people as if I were some common criminal who doesn't deserve basic dignity or respect." The words landed like physical blows on Eleanor and her supporters. The casual mention of Derek sent the first ripple of unease through the crowd, because anyone who had been paying attention to the evening's program knew that Derek Samuels was not just a guest at this event. He was the guest of honor, the lead sponsor, the person whose financial backing had made the entire evening possible. "Mrs. Vance doesn't seem to understand that I'm here as your guest, as your mother, as someone who helped raise the man whose company is funding this entire charity gala," Gloria continued, her voice carrying the kind of quiet strength that had sustained her through decades of challenges and that was now about to unleash consequences that Eleanor could never have imagined.
Eleanor's face went pale as the implications of what she was hearing began to penetrate her certainty. The woman she had accused of theft, the person she had demanded be publicly humiliated and searched, was claiming to be the mother of the evening's primary sponsor. But Eleanor's prejudices ran so deep that even this revelation wasn't enough to make her reconsider her actions. "That's impossible," Eleanor said, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I know Derek Samuels. I've met him. This woman cannot possibly be related to him." The racist assumptions behind Eleanor's disbelief hung in the air like toxic smoke. She was saying, without saying it directly, that the successful black businessman she knew couldn't possibly have a mother who looked like Gloria,
as if family connections somehow transcended the racial prejudices that had shaped Eleanor's narrow worldview. Gloria's response was devastating in its simplicity and power. "Derek," she said into the phone, her voice now carrying across the ballroom with crystalline clarity, "I don't think this auction is worthy of our family's support any longer. These people have made it very clear what they think of women who look like me, regardless of who we are or what we've contributed to the world." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the crowd that was now straining to hear every syllable of this unprecedented conversation. Mrs. Vance and her friends seemed to believe that charity should only be practiced by people who meet their approval, that dignity is something that can be stripped away from anyone who doesn't fit their narrow expectations of who deserves respect, Gloria continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. They've turned what should have been an evening celebrating art and opportunity into a public humiliation of someone whose only crime was appreciating beautiful things while being the wrong color in their elite space. The silence in the ballroom was now complete. Even the distant sounds of kitchen staff and music from other parts of the hotel seemed muted as hundreds of people strained to hear what was clearly becoming a historic moment. "Buy everything, Derek," Gloria said, her words carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to make such a request through decades of sacrifice and love. "Buy every single item in this auction, and then shut it down. Show them what happens when they mistake kindness for weakness, when they confuse quiet dignity with powerlessness." The command hung in the air like a thunderbolt about to strike. The crowd that had been so eager to document what they thought was someone else's downfall suddenly realized they might be recording their own destruction. Eleanor's supporters, who had been so confident in their moral superiority just moments before, now found themselves facing the possibility that they had just participated in the public humiliation of the person whose family was single-handedly funding their evening of charitable self-congratulation. Captain Thompson stepped back instinctively, understanding that whatever was about to happen would reshape the power dynamics in that room permanently. The phones that had been recording Gloria's supposed disgrace were now capturing what was clearly going to be one of the most spectacular reversals of fortune in Charity Gala history.
What happened next would become the most talked about moment in Charity Gala history. A 60-second power reversal so complete and devastating that it would be studied in business schools and recounted at dinner parties for generations to come. Across the ballroom, Derek Samuels had been listening to every word of his mother's phone call with the kind of cold fury that only comes from watching the person you love most in the world being systematically humiliated by people who should have been grateful for her presence. As Gloria's final words echoed through the suddenly silent ballroom, Derek moved with the purposeful stride of someone who had just received orders from the only person in the world whose opinion mattered more than profit margins or social standing. He walked past the frozen security guards, through the stunned crowd of onlookers, and directly toward the main stage where the evening's auctioneer had been preparing to begin the formal bidding process. Every eye of the ballroom followed his movement, though most of the guests still didn't fully understand the magnitude of what they were about to witness. They knew Derek Samuels was the evening's primary sponsor, but the connection between the successful businessman and the woman they had just watched being accused of theft was still processing in their minds like a computer trying to run a program too complex for its systems. Derek stepped onto the small stage that elevated him above the crowd, his presence commanding immediate attention from every corner of the grand ballroom. He moved to the microphone with the kind of natural authority that comes from years of addressing shareholders, business partners, and media representatives who hung on every word because billions of dollars in decisions flowed from his statements. "Ladies and gentlemen," Derek's voice boomed through the ballroom sound system, cutting through whispered conversations and nervous shuffling. "I want to thank you all for attending tonight's Art for Hope Charity Gala." His tone was perfectly professional,
giving no hint of the nuclear weapon he was about to detonate in the middle of their elegant evening. "I've just had a very enlightening conversation with my mother," Derek continued, and those 5 words sent shockwaves through the crowd that had been documenting Gloria's supposed disgrace just moments before. "She's given me some excellent advice about how to handle situations where charitable intentions collide with fundamental failures of human decency." The implication hung in the air like smoke from an explosion that hadn't quite reached its target yet. Eleanor Vance, who had been so certain of her moral authority just minutes earlier, now stood frozen as the pieces of a puzzle she should have solved immediately began falling into place with devastating clarity. Derek turned to address the auctioneer directly. His voice carried the kind of absolute certainty that comes from unlimited financial resources and the moral clarity of defending family honor. "Sir, I am Derek Samuels, founder and CEO of Samuels Logistics and the primary sponsor of tonight's event. On behalf of my company, I am placing a single, comprehensive bid to purchase every remaining lot in this auction at its opening bid price." The statement landed like a meteor hitting the earth. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the implications became clear. This wasn't just someone making a large donation. This was someone with the financial power to end the entire auction with a single decision, to transform what was supposed to be a competitive bidding process into a unilateral acquisition that would cost millions and reshape the entire evening.
The auction, Derek announced with finality that brooked no discussion, is now closed. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to absorb sound rather than simply represent its absence. Hundreds of wealthy patrons who had come to compete for prestigious art pieces, to be seen making generous bids, to participate in the social theater of competitive charity, suddenly found themselves spectators to a demonstration of financial power so overwhelming that their own contributions seemed insignificant by comparison. Eleanor Vance's jaw dropped as the full reality of what had just occurred crashed over her like a tsunami. The woman she had accused of theft was the mother of the man who had just spent millions of dollars in response to her accusations. The person she had demanded be searched like a common criminal was the beloved family member of someone with the resources to buy entire art collections on a whim. But the devastation was just beginning. The crowd that had been so eager to record what they thought was someone else's humiliation now realized they had documented their own participation in the public degradation of the family that was single-handedly funding their evening of supposed charity and cultural appreciation. Margaret Wentworth, who had been so quick to support Eleanor's accusations, now stood pale and speechless as she processed the fact that she had just participated in the attack on the mother of one of the city's most powerful businessmen. Victoria Sterling, who had demanded the bag search, looked like she was calculating how quickly she could disappear from the ballroom before the social and professional consequences of this evening began to manifest. The phones that had been recording with such enthusiasm just minutes before now seemed like weapons that had been turned against their owners. Every video, every social media post, every gleeful documentation of what they thought was justice being served had become permanent evidence of their own moral bankruptcy and spectacular misjudgment. Derek's gaze swept across the crowd, taking in every face that had participated in his mother's humiliation, every person who had stood by and watched while assumptions and prejudice masqueraded as righteous indignation. When his eyes finally landed on Eleanor Vance, the woman who had initiated this catastrophic chain of events, his expression carried the kind of cold calculation that had built a business empire and was now being directed toward a very different kind of conquest. Furthermore, Derek said, his voice carrying across the ballroom with the authority of someone whose decisions affected thousands of employees and millions in revenue, I want to address the educational opportunity that tonight's events have provided for everyone present. The crowd held its collective breath, understanding that whatever came next would determine whether this evening ended in social catastrophe or merely professional destruction. The woman they had assumed was powerless just demonstrated access to more financial resources than most of them could accumulate in multiple lifetimes, and her son was clearly just getting started with the consequences he intended to deliver. Eleanor Vance, who had been so confident in her social authority just minutes before, now found herself face to face with the reality that she had just made an enemy of someone whose resources and influence dwarfed her own, and whose motivation for revenge was as personal as it was justified.
But Derek wasn't finished, and what he did next would prove that true justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about transforming their failure into something beautiful that serves the very people they tried to exclude. The auctioneer, still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred, stammered his way through the confirmation that the multi-million-dollar transaction was indeed legitimate and binding. Every lot, from the smallest watercolor to the most prestigious sculptures, now belonged to Samuel's Logistics and its quietly dignified CEO, who had just demonstrated that family honor was worth more than any amount of money. As the crowd struggled to comprehend the financial magnitude of what they had witnessed, Derek took the microphone again, his voice carrying the kind of strategic clarity that had built a business empire and was now being deployed for a very different kind of conquest. What came next would transform individual justice into systematic change that would benefit thousands of people who had never heard of Eleanor Vance but had suffered from the same prejudices she represented. Furthermore, Derek announced, his words carrying across the ballroom with the authority of someone whose decisions affected communities and industries, all the art my company has just acquired will be immediately donated to the new community art center in the city's most underserved neighborhood. His gaze swept across the crowd, taking in every face that had participated in his mother's humiliation. Art belongs to everyone, especially those who are so often told they don't belong in rooms like this. The implication was devastating and beautiful simultaneously. The very people who had tried to exclude his mother from their elite space were now watching millions of dollars in prestigious art being redirected to serve the communities they had spent their lives ignoring. The diamond brooch that had started this entire confrontation, the piece Gloria had been accused of trying to steal, would now hang in a place where children who looked like her could admire it without anyone questioning their right to appreciate beautiful things. Eleanor Vance, who had been so confident in her social authority just 30 minutes earlier, now stood witnessing the complete destruction of everything she thought she understood about power, influence, and consequences. The woman she had tried to humiliate was now responsible for the largest single art donation in the city's history, and it was being given specifically to serve the people Eleanor had spent her life trying to keep at a distance. But Derek's strategic thinking extended far beyond tonight's justice. This wasn't just about defending his mother or punishing her attackers. This was about ensuring that institutions that tolerated discrimination would face consequences that extended far into the future. Consequences that would force them to choose between prejudice and survival. I also want to address the future of Arts for Hope as an organization, Derek continued, his tone shifting to the kind of corporate authority that made stock prices fluctuate and board members take careful notes. My company's partnership with this organization was based on the understanding that it shared our values of inclusion, respect, and equal access to cultural opportunities for all community members. The silence in the ballroom was so complete, it seemed to create its own gravitational field, pulling every whispered conversation and nervous shuffle into its overwhelming quiet. Everyone present understood they were witnessing not just the resolution of tonight's incident, but decisions that would reshape the cultural landscape of their entire city.
Tonight's events have demonstrated that there is a fundamental misalignment between our values and the culture that has been allowed to flourish within this organization's leadership and patron base, Derek said, each word landing with the precision of a surgeon making critical incisions. Therefore, effective immediately, Samuel's Logistics is withdrawing our multi-million-dollar sponsorship commitment for all future Arts for Hope events. The gasps that rippled through the crowd carried the sound of an organization's financial future disintegrating in real time. Derek's company wasn't just a sponsor, they were the primary underwriter whose support made the organization's ambitious programs possible. Without that backing, Arts for Hope would face the choice between massive downsizing or complete restructuring of their operations and leadership. This withdrawal is contingent upon the immediate resignation of the current board of directors, Derek continued, his gaze finding Eleanor Vance in the crowd and holding her stare with the kind of unwavering intensity that comes from absolute moral certainty. Leadership that tolerates discrimination, that enables the public humiliation of innocent people based on prejudice and assumptions, is leadership that cannot effectively serve communities that depend on inclusion and respect for their cultural development. Eleanor's face went ashen as the full implications crashed over her like successive waves of a tsunami. Not only had she lost the social standing that came with her board position, but her actions had triggered the collapse of an organization she had helped build over decades. Her legacy, which she had assumed would be one of cultural philanthropy and community service, was now permanently linked to the destruction of the very institution she had tried to protect through her discriminatory behavior. Margaret Wentworth and Victoria Sterling, who had been so quick to support Eleanor's accusations, now found themselves calculating the social and professional consequences of being permanently associated with the incident that had destroyed Arts for Hope's primary funding source. Their participation in tonight's events wasn't just a personal embarrassment. It was a career-defining association with discrimination that would follow them through every future board position and social engagement. The phones that had been recording with such gleeful anticipation just an hour before had captured not just individual moments of prejudice, but the systematic destruction of an organization's credibility and financial stability. Every video would serve as permanent documentation of how quickly assumptions and discrimination could transform success into catastrophe. However, Derek said, and for the first time since taking the microphone, there was something approaching warmth in his voice. Our commitment to arts education and community development remains unchanged. We will be redirecting our support to organizations and institutions that demonstrate through action, not just rhetoric, their commitment to serving all community members with dignity and respect. The promise carried hope for some and devastation for others. Organizations that had built inclusive cultures would benefit from Samuel's Logistics' redirected philanthropy, while others that tolerated or enabled discrimination would find themselves competing for resources in a marketplace where moral leadership had become a financial necessity. Eleanor Vance, who had begun the evening as a respected board member and influential patron, now stood as the person directly responsible for the financial collapse of an organization she had built over decades. Her name would be permanently associated not with cultural leadership, but with the kind of prejudice that destroyed communities rather than serving them. The transformation was complete and devastating. A woman who tried to use her social position to humiliate someone she deemed unworthy instead triggered the destruction of her own legacy and the systematic redirection of millions of dollars toward the very communities she had tried to exclude.
But what happened next proved that the most powerful victories aren't just about defeating prejudice. They're about transforming hate into hope and exclusion into opportunity. 6 months after the gala that became known as the Gloria Samuels incident, the Community Arts Center in the city's most underserved neighborhood opened its doors with a celebration that drew thousands of families who had never been welcomed in Eleanor Vance's elite circles. The diamond brooch that had triggered the entire confrontation now served as the centerpiece of the main gallery, displayed not behind glass for the wealthy few, but in an open setting where children could walk right up to it, where their faces could light up with wonder at its beauty, where no one questioned their right to appreciate something precious and valuable. Derek and Gloria stood together at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, watching as young artists from the community displayed their work alongside the masterpieces that had once been reserved for exclusive auctions. The transformation was complete. Art that had been hoarded by the privileged was now inspiring the next generation of creators who understood that beauty belongs to everyone. The media coverage had initially focused on Derek's dramatic response to his mother's humiliation, but the lasting story became something far more powerful. This wasn't just about a wealthy son defending his mother's honor. This was about how one family's commitment to dignity had created opportunities for thousands of young people who now had access to art education, studio space, and mentorship programs that would shape their futures. Eleanor Vance had faced exactly the consequences her actions deserved. Her resignation from multiple boards, her social ostracism, and her permanent association with discrimination had effectively ended her influence in philanthropic circles. But more importantly, her attempt to exclude had instead created the most inclusive arts institution the city had ever seen. As Gloria watched children from her old neighborhood explore the gallery that now bore her name, she understood that sometimes the most beautiful justice comes not from punishment, but from transformation. The hurt that Eleanor had tried to inflict had become healing for an entire community, and the assumptions about who deserved respect had been replaced with the certainty that dignity belongs to everyone.
Here's what Derek understood that most people never learn. The most powerful response to discrimination isn't just defending yourself. It's transforming the attack into lasting change for everyone who comes after you. He could have simply embarrassed Eleanor privately or fired back with angry words. Instead, he turned his mother's pain into thousands of children's opportunities, proving that strategic love is more powerful than reactive anger. As someone who's witnessed these elite circles from the inside, I can tell you that what happened at that gala wasn't unique. The assumptions, the instant judgments, the casual cruelty disguised as concern for security. It happens every day in spaces where wealth assumes it can determine worth. But Derek's response created a blueprint. When prejudice attacks your family, don't just defend them. Transform the entire system so no other family has to endure what yours did. The real lesson here isn't about having unlimited resources to buy justice. It's about understanding that true power means using whatever you have to create permanent change, not temporary satisfaction. Gloria's dignity defended became an entire community's dignity restored. If you believe that family love should be a force for community transformation, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who understands that the best revenge against exclusion is radical inclusion. Subscribe for more stories where justice isn't just personal, it's generational. Because sometimes the most beautiful response to hate is building something better for everyone.